Alright folks, so today's vodcast is for Chapter 2, Section 4, which deals with Egyptian civilization, and really the main idea today is how did religion and learning play important roles in ancient Egyptian civilization. So our lesson objectives for this lesson, first of all, is to describe the ways in which religious beliefs shaped the lives of ancient Egyptians. So we're going to talk a lot about religion, what their religion was like, and so on. The next lesson objective is to understand how Egyptians viewed the afterlife. Right, they had this very specific view on what the afterlife would be like and how you would get there, and the journey that you would take. Next, we'll look at and explain how the Egyptians organized their society. So we'll be filling in another pyramid here with the different levels of social classes in the Egyptian society. So we'll look at who they were. We're going to outline the advances that Egyptians made in learning, the arts, science, and literature. So there are a lot of things that we still use today and have helped us get to the point that we are today that came from the ancient Egyptians from thousands of years ago when they were learning about these things for the first time. So first of all, we're going to look at the religious beliefs here. In Egypt, life was completely about their religion. Their religion was so important that everything that they did was shaped and life revolved around what their religious beliefs were. There are inscriptions on monuments and paintings and tombs which show us this, right? This is how we know about this, that the religion was so extremely important, right? There are inscriptions everywhere on monuments and paintings and tombs, hieroglyphics that we find in the tombs. Just really shows us that religion was so important. All right, so a little bit about the chief gods and goddesses. The chief god was the sun god. The sun was the most important thing to them. Without the sun, they would not have been able to produce the food that they needed, and they would not have been able to have the civilization that they had. The sun god was known as Amun-Re. Pharaohs were supposedly received their right to rule from Amun-Re. And then we have Osiris and Isis are the two other most important gods in Egyptian religion. Egyptians related more to these gods. There is this story behind Osiris and Isis that they could relate to. Osiris became known as the god of the afterlife in the Nile. Isis became known as the goddess for women, basically, right? How to carry out women-like duties like preparing food and taking care of the children. There are the three gods there. Okay, Amun-Re, the one that has the sun on top of his head. Right? He's the sun god. You have Osiris. If you notice, he looks like he's wrapped up, so he looks like a mummy. Right? He becomes the god of the afterlife. And then you have Isis, who is nursing a child. Right? She is the goddess of women and what women-like duties were at the time. So one pharaoh, though, tried to change the religion. Right? This was a big part of Egyptian history. He tried to get rid of all of the religious beliefs that were there before and start worshiping a different god. Okay, this pharaoh was known as Amenhotep IV, and he challenged the powerful priests of Amun-Re. A lot of the priests of Amun-Re were very powerful. They had a lot of influence over the pharaohs, and he wanted to get rid of this influence that they had on him and on the pharaohs of Egypt. He worshipped a minor god named Aton, so he changed his name to Akhenaton, which literally means he who serves Aton. And his changes had little success. After his death, priests of the old gods, they reasserted their power. They got rid of the next pharaoh who was in charge, did not worship Aton, and chose to worship Amun-Re again. All right, so this would be like, let's say the Pope of the Catholic Church today decided that he was no longer going to worship Jesus Christ, but he was going to worship the Buddha. Right? He's going to worship some other god. This would be a big deal for any Catholics, right? The fact that their leader was choosing to worship a different god. It didn't last very long. It only lasted as long as Amenhotep was alive. Once he died, it all went back to normal, went back to the earlier religious beliefs. All right, so our next objective is to talk about and understand how Egyptians viewed the afterlife. So we realized that religion was extremely important to them. Part of all religions, mostly, is you believe in something that happens to you when you die, right? So the Egyptians believed in an afterlife. When you die, something happens, you go somewhere. And each religion is a little bit different with that, but the Egyptians viewed this in a particular way. So you had to prove oneself to Osiris, which Osiris was the god of the afterlife. Each soul had to pass a test to win eternal life, kind of like going to St. Peter's gates to get into heaven. You have to pass a test there and show that you were a good person before you get into heaven. So kind of same thing here. In the Egyptian afterlife, you had to pass a test that Osiris had for you before you could get to the afterlife. Your soul would be ferried across the lake of fire to Osiris. Osiris then would weigh your soul's heart against the feather of truth. If you were found to be a sinner, you were fed to the crocodile-shaped eater of the dead. And if you were found to be a worthy soul, meaning you get to go to the afterlife, you enter this place called the happy field of food, right? Which to me, going to the happy field of food sounds a little bit more like something I would want to do than going to the place where the eater of the dead lives. So there is, first of all, a painting, a piece of hieroglyphics of Osiris. He was seen as being green. He was always depicted with having green skin. And here is on a piece of papyrus a painting showing the supposed eater of the dead, right, as a half or part crocodile, part cheetah, part hippo type of animal. Right, all animals that were found in Egypt or near Egypt. This is just a hieroglyphic depicting the weighing of your soul's heart. Right? So on the left side you have the soul's heart, on the right side you have the feather of truth. Depending on what happened when these were weighed against one another, you're either found to be a sinner or a worthy soul, somebody who was able to enter the happy field of food. Now, when you died, you had to have a bunch of things happen to your body before you could go to the afterlife. This is one of the beliefs of the Egyptians at this time. They believed the afterlife would be much like life on Earth, so anything that you needed on Earth, you would also need in the afterlife. So you'd be buried with things that you would typically use on a day-to-day basis. So they buried the dead with everything they would need for that afterlife, and they perfected this process called mummification, which was the preservation of bodies by embalming them and wrapping them in cloth. And we'll talk about embalming, and I'm going to show you a short video on embalming, but basically it means taking out any moisture that's in the body, right? That means taking out any organs that are inside your brain, any of your internal organs, and making sure your body's as dry as possible. That way it can stay preserved. That's why when we find these mummies a few thousand years later, for the most part, they still have a lot of the flesh and a lot of the hair and the different things on the body that you would typically not see with a piece of human remains that was a few thousand years old. They were able to preserve the bodies enough so that they would be able to last thousands of years and look similar to what they would have looked like when they were still alive. Excuse me. Now, the most famous of the Egyptian pharaohs was this pharaoh named King Tut. He is the most famous because we found everything in his tomb as if nobody had touched it. It was hidden from tomb raiders, people who would try to find these tombs and steal all of the gold and the valuables that were in them. Nobody ever found King Tut's tomb until an anthropologist and an archaeologist team found it. So they found it intact, like it would have been a few thousand years ago when King Tut was buried. Most tombs of Egyptian pharaohs have been robbed, like I said. However, in 1922, the tomb of really this insignificant king, King Tutankhamun, who was this 18-year-old boy, was found. All of the objects found in the tomb fill several rooms in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So now if you go to Cairo and go to the Egyptian Museum, it takes up several rooms in the museum. There was so much stuff that was left behind and that was buried with him so that he could have that in the afterlife. We're just going to explain how the Egyptians organized their society. So we're going to be filling in a pyramid here. Right at the very top of the social class pyramid was the pharaoh and his family. We sometimes refer to the family as nobles. It's just him, his brothers and sisters, his sons or daughters. Anybody who was related to the pharaoh would be part of the royal family and would be at the very top of society. Below them would be government officials and the high priests. So basically anybody who has a really important government official job and anybody who's very high up in the priesthood in Egyptian religion. Right? Both are very important to what happens in Egypt. Then we have merchants, scribes, and artisans, right? People who trade, people who can read and write, and people who make stuff. Right? And then at the very bottom, we would have farmers. Most people were farmers. Probably like 95% of the population was made up of farmers. There were a small percentage of the population were slaves, but they did not have a lot of slaves. Right? Most of the people who did the work for the Pharaoh were farmers. They were not forced to do the work. They did the work because they thought the Pharaoh was a god. Peasants expected to serve the Pharaoh. This is why most of the people who built the pyramids were farmers, were peasants. They thought they were expected to serve, right? It's not that they thought they were slaves or anything like that, but they were expected to serve their god, their leader. More trade allowed for more social mobility. So once people started trading more, you could go from being a farmer possibly to being a merchant. And if you were really good at trading stuff, then you could move up in social class, right? You didn't have to be a farmer if you were born a farmer. Okay, a little bit about Egyptian women, because in Egypt, women were given a higher status than in most other parts of the world at this time. Doesn't mean they were equal by any means, but they were given higher status. They were able to do things that women were not able to do in other societies that, again, that existed around the same time in different parts of the world. Right, so there's a famous quote from one of the famous pharaohs, Ramses II. He said, "The foot of an Egyptian woman may walk where it pleases her, and no one may deny her." Right, so Egyptian women didn't have to ask permission from their husbands or their brothers or their fathers really to do much. They could do, for the most part, what they wanted to do, right, without having to ask permission from a man. There are a few things women could not do. They could not learn to read and write, and since they couldn't learn to read and write, they couldn't have jobs being scribes or being government officials. In each of those jobs, you would have to be able to read and write. So women were limited to some of the jobs that they could have, but they were able to do some other things, right? So women could, however, manage farm estates. They could be the head of their household. They could be the head of their farm. If their husband died, for example, they did not have to give the farm up to one of her sons, or her brother or her father. She would be able to manage the estate herself. So you could own land, basically. They could also serve as doctors. You could become a doctor. You could become a physician if you were a woman in ancient Egypt. And you could also enter the priesthood, which priests had pretty good jobs. Priests were seen as having a high social status, and women could have those jobs that gave them a higher social status than maybe just being a farmer. Right. This is just a painting showing an Egyptian woman acting as a physician, right, taking care of the sick at one of the hospitals that they would have had in ancient Egypt. All right, last thing we're going to do is outline the advances that Egyptians made in learning, the arts, science, and literature, so things that they contributed to that in some ways we still use today. So on the left we have their version of writing, hieroglyphics. Right? Again, writing eventually leads to the alphabet, but they were one of the first civilizations to have a type of writing. This is a picture of something very famous called the Rosetta Stone, which we'll talk about in class. Which allowed anthropologists and archaeologists to translate different Egyptian hieroglyphics. And then over here on the right, looks kind of gross, right? But it is a wooden foot, okay? A wooden foot and a wooden toe. This would have been for somebody who maybe would have had their toe cut off, maybe from building the pyramids, and a big stone fell on their foot. They would be able to attach this to their foot so that they could still walk and still be able to get around better than they would be able to without a toe. Right, so there's some different medical advances that Egyptians came up with as well. So first of all, they keep written records, right? So they had different types of writing. They developed several different writing systems. The first of which was called hieroglyphics, which are the ones we're most familiar with, which are things that look like paintings, which can be translated into words and can be translated into written language. There's also hieratic writing, which they would use more for keeping records and different things like that. You don't have to draw a painting on a wall every time that you need to write something down. So they would use hieratic writing on things like papyrus to keep track of records and keep track of transactions and different things like that through trade. And they would, again, write that hieratic writing on papyrus, which was a plant that was grown along the Nile, and they were able to weave these pieces of plant together to make a paper-like material. It's not exactly like the paper that we use today, but they were able to write on it just like we are able to write on paper today. All right, so some clues from the Rosetta Stone. Basically what the Rosetta Stone was, it was a piece of stone that was found that had 3 languages on it. Right? Originally, we really couldn't read what the Egyptian hieroglyphics said, but we find this stone that has the same passage, the same piece of writing written in hieroglyphics, written in Demotic script, and then also written in Greek. Anthropologists could not understand hieroglyphics, they could not understand Demotic script, but what they could do is understand Greek. And since they knew Greek, they would be able to translate some of the words from the Demotic script and some of the words from hieroglyphs. So they were able to figure out the meaning of many of the hieroglyphics, not all of them, but with this stone, they were able to figure out Egyptian language for the most part. So that anthropologists today can look at a wall from one of the pyramids or a wall from one of the tombs and figure out what it's saying for the most part. They would not have been able to do this without the Rosetta Stone. Right, so a little bit about furthering science and mathematics. The biggest thing that allowed them to advance in science is that they mummified bodies. So they knew a lot about the human body since they really cut it up into pieces, right, and took parts of it out, and they were able to figure out why things worked the way that they did and so on. Doctors became skilled at observing symptoms, they became skilled at diagnosing illnesses, and also at finding cures, right, from knowing so much about the human body. They were able to have surgical operations performed, right? They would actually have different types of surgery, right, amputations, right, different surgical operations were able to be performed on live human beings, similar to as they were being performed on a dead human being that they would use for that they would be mummifying. They studied the heavens, astronomy. The pyramids, right, are directly facing magnetic north, and they were able to do that because they did study the stars, and they would use the stars to help them face the pyramids in that direction. They developed geometry, right, which helped them to survey farms and also to build the pyramids. The pyramids were perfectly square, and they were only able to do that because they understood geometry very well. So different medical advances that allowed things like amputees to have prosthetic limbs, like a prosthetic toe, or a fake toe that you would use to be able to walk around and get around better. Right? And then obviously the pyramids. All right, so that is it for the Chapter 2, Section 4 vodcast. Most of the things in here we will be talking about in class. Make sure you filled in the guided notes as you did this, and I will see you guys in class.